She was my friend's mom, kind, composed, and completely off-limits. But one quiet night, beneath the sound of rain and the glow of candlelight, her whisper changed everything I thought I knew about boundaries, and about love. It started like any other weekend. I'd stopped by Liam's house to return his camera lens, the one he'd let me borrow for my photography class. The plan was simple: drop it off, maybe hang out for a bit, then head home. But when I arrived, Liam was already backing his car out of the driveway, windows fogged from the late summer humidity. He rolled it down just long enough to shout that his shift got moved up and he'd be gone till midnight. Before I could reply, he was gone, leaving me standing there with the lens in hand and a faint echo of exhaust in the air. His mom opened the door before I even knocked. "He didn't tell you he'd be leaving early, did he?" she said, her voice a mix of apology and amusement. I shook my head, smiling awkwardly. She looked effortlessly put together, a loose cream blouse tucked into soft jeans, her dark hair falling over her shoulder like she hadn't noticed it was perfect. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "You might as well stay for dinner." I made too much again. The invitation shouldn't have felt strange, but it did. I'd known her for years, she'd driven us to soccer games, laughed with us over burnt pizza. But as I stepped into the house, something felt different. Maybe it was the quiet. Or maybe it was the way the late afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, painting everything gold. She moved easily through the kitchen, humming to herself as she stirred something fragrant on the stove. Garlic, tomato, basil, a scent that made the whole room feel alive. "You can sit," she said, glancing over her shoulder. Her smile was easy, warm. But when our eyes met for a second too long, I looked away first. We talked about small things at first: classes, work, the weather that kept threatening rain. But every few sentences, she'd laugh softly, and I'd catch myself studying her face, the fine lines near her eyes, the way her lips curved when she smiled. Details I'd never noticed before, or maybe never allowed myself to. At one point she leaned over the counter to pour wine into a pan, and I caught the faintest scent of her perfume, something floral, subtle, grounding. She caught me watching, and for a heartbeat, neither of us said a word. Then she smiled again, lighter this time, and turned back to the stove. In that silence, I realized something unsettling: the house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt intimate. And though I didn't know it then, that quiet dinner invitation, spoken so casually, would change the way I saw her, and myself, forever. Dinner started simply enough: pasta, salad, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. She set the table with a calm rhythm, like she'd done it 1,000 times before, humming along to an old Norah Jones song playing softly from a Bluetooth speaker. Outside, dusk was sliding into night, and through the kitchen window I could see the faint shimmer of rain beginning to fall, a slow, cooling drizzle that softened the edges of everything. She sat across from me, the candle between us flickering gently, catching the light in her eyes. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. There was no need. The sound of the rain, the quiet music, the occasional clink of cutlery, it all created this strange peace that felt too deliberate to break. "So," she finally said, smiling over her glass of wine, "how's the photography going?" That single question opened something I didn't expect. She listened, really listened, as I talked about my projects, my uncertainty about the future, and how sometimes it felt like I was wandering without direction. There was no polite nodding, no half-distracted replies. She asked questions that made me think, made me want to explain myself better. At one point, as I spoke, she leaned her chin on her hand and just watched me. There was no judgment in her expression, just quiet focus, a kind of attention I wasn't used to. And somehow, under that gaze, my words came easier. When I asked her about her own dreams, she paused before answering. "You stop thinking about those after a while," she said softly. "Life starts making choices for you." The way she said it, calm, matter-of-fact, carried a sadness I hadn't heard before. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. She looked down for a moment, then smiled again, as if to smooth away the heaviness she'd just revealed. As she reached across the table to pass me the bread, her fingers brushed mine. It was brief, a flicker of warmth, a mistake that neither of us corrected too quickly. I felt my pulse jump, and when I looked up, her eyes met mine. There was a spark of something, not shock, not guilt, just awareness. The conversation wandered after that, soft and slow. We talked about music, travel, her favorite books. But underneath it all, something had shifted. The space between us felt alive, full of words we weren't saying. By the time we finished eating, the rain had grown heavier outside, but inside, the air was warm, fragrant, quietly electric, as if the evening itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what might happen next. The rain that had started as a soft drizzle during dinner turned heavier, drumming gently against the roof until it felt like the whole world had slowed down. The power flickered once, twice, then steadied again, leaving the house wrapped in the golden hush of lamplight. She moved to the window, drawing the curtains halfway open, and smiled faintly. "I always like nights like this," she said. "Everything outside feels far away." I joined her by the window. The glass was cool beneath my fingertips, fogging slightly with our breath. The street beyond was blurred by the rain, each drop catching the dim glow of the streetlights. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, then silence again. It felt like we were sealed inside a small, private world, one that belonged to no one but us. She carried 2 mugs of tea to the couch, the steam curling upward in small ghostly swirls. "You can stay a little longer," she said, almost absently, as she tucked her legs beneath her and pulled a soft throw blanket over her lap. I sat on the far end of the couch, trying not to feel how small the distance really was between us. The conversation drifted the way rain does, slow, meandering, but never still. She told me about her younger years, about how her life hadn't unfolded quite the way she'd imagined. "You think there's always time to start over," she murmured, looking down at her hands. "Then one day you realize time's been quietly moving past you the whole time." There was a tremor of vulnerability in her words, and something in me wanted to bridge the space, to comfort her, even if I didn't know how. "You still have time," I said quietly. "You just have to decide it's yours again." She turned her head toward me, her expression unreadable for a second. Then she smiled, small, genuine, a little sad. "You sound older than you are," she said softly. A silence followed, filled only by the rain. She shifted slightly, her shoulder brushing mine. It was so subtle that if either of us moved even an inch, it would have been gone. But neither of us did. Her warmth seeped through the space between us, grounding, real. After a moment, she leaned her head gently against my shoulder, not as a question, but as a sigh. I didn't move, didn't speak. I just listened to the rhythm of the rain, the steady beat of her breathing beside me. It was quiet, impossibly tender, the kind of closeness that said everything words couldn't. The storm outside began to ease, tapering into a soft drizzle that whispered against the windows. The living room was dim now, lit only by the lamp beside the couch and the fading glow from the fireplace. She hadn't moved from her place beside me, though the quiet had stretched long between us, not uncomfortable, just full of things neither of us knew how to name. She stirred first, sitting up a little and pulling the blanket tighter around her. "I can't remember the last time I talked this much," she said with a small laugh, though her voice carried a tired honesty. "It's strange, I don't usually say things like that out loud." I smiled faintly. "Sometimes it's easier with someone who doesn't expect anything back." Her eyes met mine at that, steady, searching. "And what do you expect?" she asked, voice almost teasing, but with an undertone I couldn't quite read. The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, tracing a finger along the edge of my mug before I answered. "Nothing, I guess. I just like hearing you talk. You make everything sound calm, even when it's not." She looked away, exhaling slowly. The faintest smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. You're kind, she said. Different from most your age. Her tone softened on those last words, not maternal, not flirtatious, just sincere. The rain's rhythm slowed even further, each drop spaced out like a heartbeat. I wanted to say more but couldn't find the right words. Instead, I watched her fingers play with the edge of the blanket, slow, thoughtful movements that said more than her expression did. I used to think calm meant happy, she murmured. But calm is just quiet. It doesn't always mean peace. Her voice lingered in the air between us, and before I could stop myself, I said softly, "You deserve peace. More than anyone I've met." That made her look up again. For a moment, neither of us moved. The space between us felt fragile, balanced on the edge of something dangerous and beautiful. She smiled faintly, almost wistfully. "Careful," she whispered. Words like that can make people forget what's right. Her eyes held mine a little too long, the kind of gaze that slows time. Then she reached out, just briefly, and touched my hand. Her fingers were warm, trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said, almost under her breath. It wasn't a confession in the way stories tell it, no grand declarations, no stolen kiss. But in that quiet moment, with the rain fading and her hand resting lightly on mine, I felt something undeniable pass between us, something honest, fragile, and deeply human. The night had grown still by the time I stood to leave. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world outside glistening, the pavement reflecting the porch light in small golden puddles. She walked me to the door, the hem of her sweater brushing lightly against her jeans, her hair slightly tousled from the hours we'd spent talking. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was something heavier, fuller. Every step toward the door felt like walking away from a delicate dream that hadn't quite ended. When we reached the hallway, she turned to me with that quiet smile, the one that always seemed to hide more than it revealed. "Thank you," she said softly. "For tonight." I didn't realize how much I needed the company. I nodded, unsure what to say. "Me too," was all I managed, though it didn't feel like enough. The house smelled faintly of rain and candle wax, the air warm but charged, as if the storm outside had simply moved indoors. She stepped closer, reaching to rest her hand on my arm. It was meant to be a simple gesture, polite, grateful, but something about it made the air shift again. Her touch was soft, steady, and yet I could feel my pulse jumping beneath her fingers. She must have felt it too, because she hesitated, her eyes flicking up to meet mine. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The moment was fragile, suspended between restraint and something else entirely. Her gaze dropped briefly to my lips before she caught herself and looked away, pressing her lips together in a faint, knowing smile. "You should go," she whispered finally, her voice low but gentle. "Before we forget what's right." The words cut through the quiet like a thread snapping. She didn't step back immediately, not until I nodded. Even then, her hand lingered for a second longer on my sleeve before sliding away. That single motion, so small, so deliberate, carried more weight than anything that could have been said. I opened the door, letting in the cool night air. The scent of wet grass drifted in, mingling with her perfume. She stood there in the doorway, arms folded loosely, her expression soft but guarded. "Good night," she said, almost like a sigh. "Good night," I echoed, my voice rougher than I intended. As I walked to my car, I didn't look back, though every instinct told me to. Behind me, the house glowed faintly through the rain-streaked windows. And for the first time, I understood how something could feel so right and so wrong at the same time, like holding your breath between two worlds, knowing you can't stay in either. The next morning felt quieter than it should have. The world outside had been washed clean by the night storm, streets glimmering under early sunlight, leaves dripping with dew. I hadn't slept much. My mind kept circling back to that moment by the door, the way she'd looked at me, the way her voice had trembled when she said we should stop. I told myself it meant nothing, that it was just exhaustion and emotion, but deep down I knew better. When I pulled into their driveway to drop off the umbrella I'd borrowed, the house already smelled faintly of coffee and toast. She was in the kitchen, hair loosely tied back, wearing a soft gray sweater that hung a little off her shoulder. She looked different in the daylight, gentler, but somehow more guarded. "You're up early," she said with a small smile. Her voice was calm, like last night had never happened. "There's coffee if you want some." I nodded, stepping inside. The morning light fell across the kitchen in pale streaks, catching in the steam that rose from her mug. She moved around with quiet grace, not hurried, but not relaxed either, like someone trying to maintain control of something fragile. We didn't talk much. The silence wasn't cold, but cautious, as if both of us were afraid the wrong word might bring the night rushing back. The only sounds were the clinking of spoons and the faint chirp of birds outside the window. When I finally spoke, my voice came out softer than I meant. "About last night." She didn't look up. "It's okay," she said quickly, her tone kind but firm. "We were just tired. It was a long day." She turned then, meeting my eyes with a small, knowing smile, one that carried more truth than her words did. I wanted to tell her it hadn't felt like a mistake, that it had felt real. But something about the steadiness in her gaze stopped me. She didn't need reassurance, and she wasn't asking for it. What she needed, maybe, was distance, or dignity. Instead, I just nodded. "Thank you," I said quietly. "For dinner." "For everything." Her expression softened. "You're a good man," she murmured. "Don't let moments like this confuse that." The words lingered as I turned to leave. Outside, the morning air felt cool and alive against my skin. I could still feel the warmth of her kitchen, the sound of her voice echoing faintly in my head. By the time I reached my car, the spell had faded, but not the memory. That stayed, quiet and steady, like a mark left by something that almost happened but never would. Weeks passed before I saw her again. Life moved on, at least on the surface, classes, work, late nights editing photos. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I'd catch myself thinking about that night, the smell of rain, the warmth of her hand, the way she whispered before we forget what's right. It replayed not like regret, but like a memory that refused to fade, gentle and unresolved. When Liam invited me over for a family barbecue, I almost said no. But curiosity, or maybe courage, made me go. The afternoon sun was bright, the yard filled with easy laughter and the smell of grilled food. Children ran barefoot through the grass. Everything looked so ordinary, so safe, that for a moment I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. Then I saw her. She stood near the back porch, arranging plates on the table, sunlight catching in her hair. She looked up, and when our eyes met, her expression didn't falter, just softened into a calm, knowing smile. There was no tension, no trace of awkwardness, only quiet recognition. It was as if we'd silently agreed that what happened that night would stay where it belonged, between us, untouched, unspoken. "Hey, stranger," she said when I walked over. Her tone was light, easy. "You disappeared for a while." "Yeah," I said, smiling. "I've been busy with school." We talked casually, about Liam, about the weather, about nothing that really mattered. Yet beneath every ordinary word, there was a tenderness that didn't need to be named. Her laugh came easier than I remembered, and for a brief second, I caught a glimpse of the woman from that quiet night, the one who'd let herself be honest, even just for a moment. As the sun began to set, people started packing up. I helped her carry dishes inside. In the doorway, with voices fading in the background, she turned to me. Her expression softened, serious, but warm. "You've grown into someone kind," she said quietly. "Someone I'm proud to have known." The words caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond, but she just smiled and shook her head, as if to say don't ruin it by speaking. Then she touched my arm lightly, a gesture so simple, yet full of meaning, and walked back toward the patio. I stood there for a long moment, watching her blend into the soft glow of the evening. That night, driving home with the windows down, I realized she hadn't been tempting me back then. She'd been teaching me something about restraint, about connection, about the kind of affection that doesn't need to be acted on to be real. And in that quiet understanding, I finally felt at peace. If you felt the weight of their unspoken connection, that quiet, forbidden tenderness that almost became something more, then don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes that love isn't always about what happens, but what almost does. Speech balloon, tell me in the comments, have you ever shared a moment that changed how you saw someone forever? Every story leaves a trace. Let's talk about yours.